Hello. This week's topic is the Constitution, so please read Chapter 2 in your textbook before attempting the written question for the week. But I did want to talk about one of the topics that's discussed in Chapter 2, and that is the issue of constitutional amendments. As you'll read in Chapter 2, the Constitution is the supreme law of our country. That means that all the laws that we pass in this country at both the federal and state level must fit with what's in the Constitution. So if any law that Congress passes or any law passed by the states in any way goes against the Constitution, it's the responsibility of the federal courts to strike those laws down. And certainly from time to time over the last 200 years, the Supreme Court has struck down laws passed either by Congress or the states and declared them to be unconstitutional. In the reading, you'll read about the process of amending the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution were aware that since the Constitution would be the supreme law of our country, they didn't want to make it easy for Congress or the states to change the Constitution because then it would not have meaning. But they also didn't want to make it impossible to change because they had just gone through this 4-month constitutional convention in which there were a lot of debates and discussions, as you'll read in the chapter, and it caused a lot of turmoil in the country. And they said we need to make the Constitution flexible enough that if at some point in the future people decide that there needs to be a change made to it, that they can find a way to do it. But again, they didn't want to make it easy, so they were looking for kind of a balance between a difficult and an easy process of amendments. So the process they came up with is the one that's discussed in your chapter, and essentially it has 2 steps to it. The first step is proposal of an amendment, and there are 2 methods of proposal. The first is for 2/3 of Congress to pass the amendment, which would be 2/3 of the House plus 2/3 of the Senate. So an amendment would be introduced in either the House or Senate. It would get a 2/3 majority in one House, go to the other House, and then it would be officially proposed. The other method of proposal would be for 2/3 of the states to call on Congress to have a constitutional convention. That second method of proposal has never been used. The only constitutional convention we've had in our history was the one in 1787 that's discussed in Chapter 2. But if the states really wanted Congress to have a constitutional convention and enough of them agreed to it, then Congress would have to hold one. Once an amendment has been proposed, then it goes to the states. So we'll assume that it's an amendment that's been proposed by Congress by the 2/3 majority. They then send it to the states. There are 2 methods of ratification. One is for 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment. It would be the state legislatures. The legislature is the lawmaking body for a state. And so what Congress would do is it would send the amendment to the state legislatures. So in our case, it would go to Lansing. And then the members of the state legislature in each of the state capitals would look at the amendment and then vote on it. And if the 2 chambers of each legislative body were to approve it, then we would say that state has ratified the amendment. And then under the terms of the Constitution, once 3/4 of the states have ratified the amendment, which today would be 38 states because we have 50 total states, once 38 states ratify the amendment, it would then be added to the Constitution. There is one other method of ratification that's only been used once, and that is for 3/4 of the states just to hold a ratifying convention to approve the amendment. So actually all the states would hold a ratifying convention, and if 3/4 of those ratifying conventions approve the amendment, again 38 states, then it would be added to the Constitution. That second method of ratification has only been used once in our history. So out of the 27 amendments there have been since 1791, only one was ratified through that second method I just discussed. Once an amendment has been ratified, it is now part of the Constitution, and it must be treated as an equal part of the Constitution, which means that when courts are interpreting what the Constitution means, they have to include the amendments. Now, as you'll read in the chapter, and there is a chart listing the amendments to the Constitution, most of the amendments have dealt with expanding rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution were ratified in 1791, and they are the Bill of Rights. They provided for the individual rights of Americans, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, It also the Bill of Rights also includes the rights of the accused, so the right of a criminal defendant to have a lawyer at trial. There's the right against double jeopardy, which means that if someone is found not guilty by a jury, he or she cannot be tried again for that same crime. Another example of a right of the accused is the right to see to a speedy trial, the right to have a jury of your peers decide whether you're guilty or not of the crime. And there's freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, which means you have a right to privacy in your home. And if law enforcement want to come into your home, they have to have a proper search warrant or probable cause. I should mention that each of those amendments has been extended to the states, so that initially they only applied to at the federal level. Now they apply at both the federal and state level, and we'll discuss that more in Chapter 4. The rest of the amendments, so those what I just discussed were the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. The other 17 amendments dealt with things like voting rights for African Americans, voting rights for women, the lowering of the voting age to 18, which occurred in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, the limit of the president to 2 full terms in office, which was not in the original Constitution but was added as an amendment. There was an amendment added on presidential disability, which means that if something happens to the president and he or she is incapacitated, there is a process for putting the vice president into power, at least temporarily. That was an amendment to the Constitution. The most recent amendment was passed in 1992, and it prohibits Congress from changing its pay during its current term of office. The pay rates for members of Congress are decided by Congress itself, and so there was a feeling that it wouldn't be fair for Congress to. It actually doesn't prohibit them from voting for pay raises, but it means that that the pay raises do not go into effect until after the next election. So it's a way to hold the members of Congress accountable, so that if the voters don't like the fact that they voted themselves a pay raise, they can maybe vote for someone else in that election. So it kind of holds the members of Congress accountable. But those are some examples of amendments. Most of the amendments have been viewed as positive. There was the amendment back in the 1920s that prohibited the sale and use of alcohol in the United States. And generally that's considered to have been a failed effort at using the Constitution to amend or to prohibit something. There was a feeling that was not appropriate. Certainly local communities have the ability to restrict the sale of alcohol, but that should not have been written into our Constitution. But once the Constitution was amended with the prohibition provision, the only way to get rid of it was with another amendment. So in 1933, there was overwhelming support in Congress and the states to repeal prohibition, and so there was an amendment passed that repealed prohibition, so that it is now up to the states and local communities to decide whether to restrict alcohol or not, but it is not prohibited, obviously, by the federal Constitution. So I mentioned a few of those. Please do read the information in the book on constitutional amendments, and pay particular attention to the list of amendments that you'll find in that chapter, and kind of get a sense of what they mean. You'll also find the Bill of Rights and the other amendments in the appendix to the Constitution at the end of your book. So amendments 1 through 27 are all in your book. So if you have any questions, please contact me by email or phone, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you.